Though, Scott Ludlam, let me start with you. Your reaction to this debate, which has just gone on for 10 minutes here, but it's been going on for longer than that around the country and through the newspapers and on television. Thoughts?
I think the last 10 minutes is kind of an interesting microcosm. I don't know that it was tactically a good idea to try and personify the issues in the form of Malcolm Turnbull. The basic issues themselves I've got no quarrel with, whether it's multinational tax avoidance or the structural magnifiers of inequality in our tax system, are things that should be contested and should be in the public debate. But I don't know that trying to pin that on Malcolm Turnbull or make him the kind of poster boy for that stuff has worked particularly well. As we've just seen this morning, we just spent 10 minutes talking about whether Turnbull's done anything wrong. It might have been more interesting to have spent 10 minutes talking about how multinationals salt tax away.
Well, we've got more time, so we can get to that. David Leyonhjelm, your reaction?
This is embarrassing. I agree with Scott.
One to me.
One to you. I don't think there should be a debate about a wealthy Prime Minister as a proxy for arguing about multinational tax avoidance or minimisation or whether our tax system is fair. Labor has a problem now. Of course, it's got a new Prime Minister who is substantially more popular than its own leader. So they're looking for a way to pull him down. That's natural enough, but I think they've chosen the wrong issue here. And the issue also is, do we really believe that we'll make people better off by tearing down wealthy people like Malcolm Turnbull, or do we think we can make people better off by lifting them all up so that they can aspire to be wealthy? I think the latter is a far more attractive option for Australians. I think they're on the wrong boat here.
All right, we're going to move on to other issues, but just one right of reply on this issue, Ed Husic, given that, in a sense, you're in the eye of the storm on this discussion. Last rides.
Well, in effect, we've been arguing the same point in terms of your latter point, Senator, about being able to give people opportunity. What we wanted to be able to see is that people in particular those that I represent, have the opportunity to do better with their lives. And when I see the policies of this government affect them, be it through education, be it through the family system, taxation system, be it through tax in terms of penalty rates, those all limit people's ability to be able to do well for themselves. And I think we do need to find a way, particularly at this time where people feel their family budgets are under pressure, wages aren't growing, unemployment's high. That's a real issue.
Those are legitimate issues, but I don't see how Malcolm Turnbull's investment in the Cayman Islands has anything to do with that. That's the point I was making. All
right, we're going to take a quick break here on Australian Agenda. When we come back, we will move on to other issues. There are a lot of them in the mix under this new look contest in Australian politics. Back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, where we're speaking to the Parliamentary Secretary to Bill Shorten, Ed Husic, Deputy Greens Leader Scott Ludlam, and Senator Key Crossbench, Senator Liberal Democrat Senator David Leyonhjelm. And obviously I'm here with Paul Kelly. Now let me start with the senators. We've spent a bit of time there talking to Ed Husic. I'd be interested in getting both of your views on the new Prime Minister and what you are expecting, what you're happy or concerned about in terms of the legislative debate in the Senate, where the Greens might go, where the crossbenchers might go. Scott Ludlam, starting with you, it does seem under new Greens leadership, Senator De Natale, as well as we've now got a new Prime Minister, it seems like there's more engagement, whether you ultimately end up agreeing or disagreeing on the policy front. It does seem like there's a willingness to work with the new government, whether that results in an outcome or not. Is that a fair interpretation?
We're certainly willing to work with any government. I mean, that's why people send us to Canberra. I think Richard does take quite a practical approach, and will have plenty of disagreements with Mr Turnbull, as we did with his predecessor. But we're not sent to Canberra to spend our days in Parliament House with the door shut. We will negotiate. To give you one quick example, I was quite impressed by Mr Turnbull's agility this week on the Gold Coast Light Rail extension. It's a good project. They've been through all their processes of due diligence. Flipping that ridiculous policy proposition that the Commonwealth wouldn't invest in cities is just a really smart thing to do. If we're able to get the Perth Light Rail project back on deck with Commonwealth funding, that's a conversation we'd be very willing to engage in.
It does look, though, I mean, aside from the policy particulars, some you'll agree on, some you won't, it just feels like there's been a removal of the hardened position of Christine Milne to Senator Di Natale, and a removal perhaps of the hardline position on the other side of the ideological spectrum from Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull, and that might just make doing business easier. Is that fair?
I've never agreed with the assessment of Christine that she was a hardliner. She got a lot of really good stuff done under the previous government. Working with Ms Gillard in particular on thinking of the climate package is what comes to mind. She's a hard negotiator and she doesn't give ground easily, but I don't think that made Christine a hardliner. But we found under the Abbott government that the door was just closed to us. We disagreed with Tony Abbott on very nearly everything, and there were a few niche issues on which we did agree, and we were able to, if we think we can get an outcome, we'll take it. I think with Mr Turnbull, what we'll find is we can have a more intelligent argument. We can dispose of the three-word slogans and just the bizarre backwardness that we saw under the last couple of years, and have a more intelligent argument. We will still disagree on a heap of stuff. If you like, we can come to some of the specifics in a bit, but I think there will be room to make some gains.
Do you think that the Turnbull government is bringing a new attitude towards Senate engagement? I mean, do you think it's more serious, more committed to consultation, talking to people, basically?
Yeah, I do, Paul. Under the previous government, if you remember, both under Rudd and Gillard, the Labor government would almost, in fact, maybe never bring a matter to the Senate if they thought it would be voted down. It was immensely rare that you would see legislation just be chopped in the Senate. And we would go through weeks where you'd just see bill after bill brought on and destroyed and go down in flames. I could never understand what the tactics were. I don't think Prime Minister Abbott understood how the Senate operates, what its role is. I mean, David, you probably saw this up close as well. I think what we saw in the last week actually is that there weren't a lot of bills brought forward. I think they're going to take their time and work out what they can negotiate through. David
Leyonhjelm, from your perspective, as a crossbencher, looking at the way that the previous Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister, has there been a shift in their dealings?
Yes. I don't know whether it's false dawn or not, but there's certainly a lot more love in the air. I had meetings with 8 ministers last week, which was really quite unprecedented.
But can I ask about that? Because that's interesting. You've met with 8 ministers. Are these new ministers? Are they the same ministers that were harder to get hold of before?
It looks like they're off the leash, if I can, to interpret the body language, if I can put it that way. They seem to be given a licence to talk to us, to negotiate, to find out how to deal with us, and some of them are better at that than others. They're sort of wanting to talk up front rather than wait until they've got something that they need our vote for. It was a little bit, as Scott said, pretty interesting. Their approach was, under the Abbott government, was they'd bring it up to the Senate, negotiate with us. If Labor and the Greens were opposed to it, they'd negotiate with us, sort of. It was kind of, can we convince you to vote for it? And then if they couldn't, they'd put it up and see what the numbers were like, and then go away sulking and sort of blame the Senate generically for not getting stuff through.
I wonder if we
it was
could,
fairly poorly handled, really.
What if we could go to practical examples
Yes.
now, in terms of, there's always a range of issues, but are there particular examples, issues or bills you could point to which indicate you think areas where progress can be made?
Yes. Well, industrial relations, for example. Ed and Scott might not like this, but they only just narrowly failed to get the reinstatement of the ABCC bill through. One vote, I think, was in it. I'm quite sure they could have negotiated that to have got a majority. The higher education bill, that would have been a little bit harder. It would have required a different approach. This kind of illustrates their entire problem. They never sold the crossbench on the need for change in the first place. So when you're arguing about what kind of change to have, you meet resistance.
So do you feel now, like in the discussions you're having now with these 8 ministers, there's more this sense of, firstly, they're trying to sell the need for change, and secondly, they're also bringing you in on the formulation of what they're going to bring forward before they actually present it to you? Is that the sense?
Well, the rhetoric has improved. Yes, the idea that there needs to be a narrative, that you can't sell a solution when you don't agree that there's a problem. There seems to be a little bit more acceptance of that. I mean, in terms of tangible outcomes, it's still to be seen, of course, but but the attitude seems to have changed.
And Scott Ludlam, are you
Changing the issue to counter-terrorism, the government has foreshadowed this week that there will be another round of counter-terrorism laws. There'll be a lowering of the age. In relation to control orders, we've seen the New South Wales Premier, Mike Baird, indicate that he wants very strong action taken. I think we'd like to get the response from each of you to what's happened this week.
I think there's, given how fluid the situation is and the fact that the people that seek to cause us harm are always changing their tactics, there'll always be another round of changes to be able to rightly ensure that we've got, particularly on the security aspects, we've got a framework in place that keeps us secure and able to deal with the threat. So certainly we've said we're prepared to work constructively with the government on that, while also recognising we shouldn't go to the extent that we curtail liberties or change the way we live our lives and in our very essence the sort of freedoms that we do enjoy because of it. So it is a difficult balancing act.
But can I just clarify, I think from what you're saying, you're implying Labor will accept the lowering of the age in relation to control orders.
We've said in the last few days we want to see the detail because there isn't any detail on the table. So let's see that first. We think that there's a well-established process of having it go through parliamentary oversight and review. That's important to retain. Let's see what happens with the detail. But I think the big thing is too, there's, you know, the thing that the overarching issue is that particularly those who want to advance terrorism, their key aim is to create fear because it divides. And it's in that division where the real battleground lies, that we're able to bring people together and not be separated by fear, recognise that, you know, we are stronger unified, but also have that firm position that deals with terrorism and make sure that we have those laws in place, measures in place, powers for authorities to deal with people who want to seek to cause harm.
Senator Leyonhjelm as well as Senator Ludlam, what are your thoughts on some of these policy scripts around national security?
I've pretty much opposed all the national security legislation that's come through already. My view is that we had plenty of laws already on the books to deal with terrorists. They're not the smartest crooks in the world, and it's really a failure of policing, if you like, that they think that they've got to bring in new laws rather than deal with the individuals concerned. Now, lowering the eligibility age for control orders or preventive detention orders wouldn't have prevented the Parramatta shooting. It's more symbolic stuff to make people feel as if the government's doing something. The onus is on the police and the security authorities to find out who the individuals with malicious intent are, what they're up to, and to put a stop to it. The incitement to genocide, I've said all along that the law of incitement would cover pretty much all of the ill-intentioned individuals with harmful intentions. So, subject to seeing the detail, and that is a key point, incitement to commit genocide might be okay from my libertarian perspective.
And Scott Ludlam?
Look, similar to my colleagues, we're always a bit reticent to cast a final view until we've seen the bill. So again, this is something that was announced in the wake of the tragedy last week that felt to me a little bit like it was sort of maybe the last in the pipeline. If you recall, Abbott is reported to have told his National Security Committee that he wanted one national security announceable per week. He wanted to be able to go out, stand in front of the flags and announce something, anything doesn't matter. And that was the kind of cynicism that I think Mr Turnbull has quite clearly stepped away from. I don't think we're going to see that kind of quite cynical exercise of the politics of that from this Prime Minister. But you do have these very long pipelines, and as David just said, having that measure in force, lowering the threshold age for control orders, actually wouldn't have caught this kid because he wasn't on the books.
That's true, but isn't to play devil's advocate to that, isn't the argument though that if they did get a line of sight on somebody who is under the current age for control orders, that those change to the age of access of control orders provides them with the capacity to then have the sort of surveillance and so forth that would hopefully next time be able to stop something like that?
To be honest, I'm much more interested in the kind of stuff that Ed was talking about just now around genuine prevention, what the community is calling out for. And you've got experts like Professor Anne Ali from Curtin University talking about strategies that have worked better overseas for prevention in places like the UK and Germany, where They're much closer to theatres of conflict in the Middle East, for example, than we are here, where actually family and community support is going to work a lot better than surveillance, punitive regimes, security hotlines and this kind of stuff. What I'm hoping we will see, and it's, you know, the ship of state takes a little while to change direction on, is that we see some of the work that Senator Fierravanti-Wells, to give her her due, has been given carriage of, to see that properly resourced, and less of the Keenan style bizarre stuff that's obviously just designed to appeal to shock jocks. And I think the early sense that I get is that Mr Turnbull is likely to hew to that course, and maybe this bill has just fallen out of the pipeline in, you know, in an opportunistic way.
But there's an operational aspect to it as well. We saw on Friday TV footage of young people in the western suburbs of Sydney refusing to cooperate with the police, saying, no, I don't know anything, no, I'm not going to tell you anything, no, 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 no. And people were remarking about that, you know, this is amazing, they don't want to cooperate. But then we also had TV footage of students who went to that school that young gunman went to in Parramatta, and the police were harassing them, slamming them up against the wall, handcuffing them, not charging them. Is it any wonder that the young ones don't want to cooperate? Is it any wonder? It's not just the law, it's also about how people are treated. And if you don't treat people with respect, you're not going to get respect back for the police.
I'd like to ask you about how you think Malcolm Turnbull, as a new Prime Minister, is relating to the Australian public on this issue. That is, this is the question of balance. You've got to be firm on the security front, but you've got to engage community. So how do you rate the Prime Minister's rhetoric and conversation on this question?
Maybe we'll start with you, Ed Husic.
For sure, much better. I think he's managed it in a much better way than his predecessor. I think he recognises the challenge of being able to have that balance of what you just referred to, about being able to have, you know, those effective laws in place to deal with and measures in place to deal with those who want to cause us harm and grief, but also do it in a way that doesn't divide. Again, I come back to this point. Terrorists want to be able to go to vulnerable people who feel scared and say, basically, you're being treated as the other. Look at how they're treating you. The way to get power is to act in the way we think, which is to stand up. And that is a deadly path that leads to no good whatsoever. We need to, one, recognise that, two, have those measures in place, and we've supported the government in terms of its counter-radicalisation programs, de-radicalisation programs, the 40 million that they've invested in, the work that's being done by different people. I've had, to be honest, a different experience with Michael Keenan. I know some of his rhetoric, you know, he's fine-tuning, but I think he's, you know, been someone I could talk to on these type of issues, because we are all in this together. We do need to make sure that we find that ground to bring people together to face a common threat.
And just quickly, can I get the panel's views? We've talked about control orders, but I'm interested in your views on what Mike Baird was discussing in terms of being able to hold people without charge for 28 days instead of the far lower number, which I think was 8 days, as something that he's seeking to do. Luke Foley, the opposition leader for Labor in New South Wales, wanted to see more details and had some concerns. Senators, your thoughts?
These laws only push out in one direction. That's what we see, and it's been part of our job, and David and I have been on the same side of the argument more often than not in the last year or two, is that these laws of expansion of police powers and coercive powers only ever go one way, and they're tremendously difficult to rein back in. The only other thing I'd add to Ed's comments earlier, though, around the Prime Minister's approach, because I tend to agree, we're not hearing the kind of bizarre sub-hysterical death cult invocation and the 9 flag press conferences and all this sort of stuff. I think he's dialed the rhetoric back, and I think everybody's actually kind of relieved about that. The other uncomfortable factor that we've got to accommodate, though, which very rarely comes into our debates here, is how our foreign policy actions inflame and add to that division that you were referring to. A couple of months ago in a briefing, ASIO showed us some of the Inspire publications that are produced by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and it's kind of terrifying stuff. It's how to make a pipe bomb, how to poison a water supply. It's full of photographs of the ruination of Gaza and dead Palestinian children, or how we just ripped Iraq to pieces. And the consequences of our foreign policy decisions in far-flung parts of the world maybe aren't that well understood by the Australian people, but they're pretty well understood by some of those that we're discussing this morning. Some of those grievances aren't merely domestic, some of them are very international in scope.
David Leyonhjelm?
No, I don't share Scott's views on the foreign policy origins of this. I think this is a fundamental fight occurring between the Sunni sect and the Shia sect of Islam, and it has huge historical roots. It's nothing to do with what's happened in contemporary history. But
Even
what
when
we're
we
doing,
show up and decide to bomb one side or another,
yeah,
like it does.
no,
But
they'd be fighting each other irrespective. And yes, we sort of have minor tweaks to how it turns out, but I don't believe it's attributable to us or the United States. What we do about it here, of course, is that if we're feeling the heat, if we're under attack from mentality that is attributable to something that happened 1,000 years ago, we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm absolutely opposed to the direction, as Scott said, that the law has been taking under this national security rubric, if you like. It is always in the one direction. We are losing our liberties fighting against a culture that doesn't believe in liberty itself. I mean, it's bizarre. We should not be doing it. And we know that it's individuals responsible, it's not groups. It's the responsibility of law enforcement, the intelligence agencies and so forth to identify those individuals, but those who are not involved, those who are not responsible, should not have their liberty compromised.
All right, we're going to take a break here on Australian Agenda. When we come back, Bill Shorten, according to Newspoll, now...
My part, I just want us to have effective ones.
And you're on a unity ticket in your concerns about this, Senator Leyonhjelm?
Yes, well, the national security legislation, Scott and I fought. The metadata, data retention, Scott and I fought. I don't think we're on the same side on the E-Safety Commissioner, the net nanny, but each of those three have been highly illiberal legacies, if you like, of the Abbott government. And I've very strong feelings about them. The thing about the metadata, in addition to what Scott and Ed have said, their reservations about it, we still don't know who's actually going to pay for it, how it's going to be paid for, where's the data going to be stored, and how's it going to be kept safe. It's only a matter of time before it gets hacked, and all this information about our internet activities and phones will be out there, high, wide and handsome on the front page of the paper or whatever. It's only a matter of time. It's a mess waiting to happen.
Just switching to economic policy, I guess the fundamental question about the Turnbull government is it going to do much on the economic reform front, or is it essentially just involving, changing the atmospherics, changing the mood of the country? So what do the three of you think is the answer to that question?
Well, I was going to say Scott Morrison hasn't had the best start. He needs to focus on a few issues instead of basically popping up idea after idea after idea. In his first week, I think he said he wanted to be a domestic, not international treasurer. He had a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and he also started floating ideas about home ownership. He really needs to provide confidence for the broader, if the issue is in an environment where there is low confidence and there's concern about growth and the impact on family well-being in terms of their financial well-being, he needs to find that range and find it quick instead of just floating idea after the other. And I think he is, as I've said earlier, he's going to have a real problem in terms of saying, to the states, cutting $80 billion in the way that he has, and then saying it's over to you to fix it up.
Scott Ludlam?
The jury's still out for me, and I feel as though the atmospherics have certainly changed, and what we saw under the previous government was a process of just ad hoc, unilaterally ruling stuff out, no matter how good the evidence base was for keeping it on the table. So some that are pretty close to my heart, things like negative gearing, capital gains tax concessions, super concessions. Let's have the debate without things just having the door slammed on them. So I think Mr Turnbull at least is off to a better start than his treasurer. I would tend to agree, and at least reconvening the roundtable, get ACOS, the ACTU and others around the table to try and work out, is there a grand bargain? Are there some possibilities of moving the debate forward? We'll have to wait, but at least the conversation's been rebooted. That's got to be worth something.
And Senator Leyonhjelm, getting back to Paul's question, in a broader sense, do you think that we are going to see action legislative action in a significant way this term, in the next year or so, from the new Prime Minister, or do you think it's more a case of him building a large platform for change and then seeking a mandate, a fresh mandate at the next election?
Probably the latter. It was music to my ears to hear Scott Morrison saying we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. We're already overtaxed. We need to lower taxes, not raise them. We can't go looking for more revenue, in my view. And until the government engages on middle-class welfare, essentially, and Labor's on board with this. Labor's no defender of middle-class welfare. Just a good example is including the family home in pension eligibility. We've got huge injustice as a result of people who don't own a home paying taxes to fund pensions for people who own multi-million-dollar houses. Until the government and the Treasurer engages on that subject, they're not going to be serious, in my view, and they won't do it this term. Who knows when the election's going to be anyway.
We are almost out of time, but just a left field one for you, Senator Leyonhjelm, as the last question, if I can. The new member for Canning talked about fighting ICE as being something that he was interested in his maiden speech. It is largely a state issue, but the Commonwealth has been weighing in on this with some sort of national approach. You were quoted in an article in The Australian as saying that we might have to look at legalising ICE. What's your strategy there?
Decriminalising is the word I use, which is different from legalising. Yeah, the prohibition approach, it didn't work in America with alcohol. It's obviously not working with most drugs. They're just as widely available as ever. We spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on law enforcement. So the prohibition approach is failed. The question is what alternative do we have? And everybody says, well, if you haven't got an alternative, how can you possibly criticise what we've got? Except we have the example of Portugal, which decriminalised the possession and use of all drugs and then took a harm minimisation approach by medicalising the problem. That deserves serious consideration. I think it's worth pursuing.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Thank you one and all. Labor's Ed Husic, from the Greens, Deputy Leader Scott Ludlam, and from the Liberal Democrats, Senator David Leyonhjelm, and to my colleague Paul Kelly, as always, thanks for your company. Thanks for watching this episode of Australian Agenda. Next